Welcome to a Shot in the Arm podcast. I'm Ben Plumley. And for the last 5 years, we've been calling this a podcast about innovation and equity in global health. But at this current moment, I'm not sure that description particularly holds. We've got a whole load of crosswinds hitting us from all sorts of directions in the field of global health. Whether it's the extraordinary collapse of funding from the US government, whether it's the decline of funding from European donors, and indeed whether it's the extraordinary resilience we're seeing from what we used to call partner countries in the global south, particularly Africa, and increasingly frustratingly, the innovation that we're seeing in scientific biomedical innovations. So I don't know what we call this at this current stage, but to help us perhaps make a little bit of sense of this extraordinary, crazy, mad situation is friend of the pod and Executive Director of AVAC, Mitchell Warren. Hey, Mitch, welcome back to A Shot in the Arm.
Thanks so much, Ben. Great to see you. And great to be a friend of the pod. That's my new title. I like that.
That's head honcho and friend of the pod. Now, for new viewers and listeners, do you want to just say a little bit about what AVAC is? For those of us, of course, from the field, from the global health and particularly the HIV field, AVAC is very much a sacred lamb for us.
Well, thank you for that, Ben. And it's been amazing when I think about our many years collaborating in different guises. But, you know, it's interestingly enough, this year, and you talk about what time we're in, this year is actually AVAC's 30th anniversary. It was founded, not by me, but by a group of amazing activists as the AIDS Vaccine Advocacy Coalition. And that little bit of history is important. It was set up to drive innovation and the development of an HIV vaccine 30 years ago. And of course, we still don't have one. But over the last 21 years that I've been the executive director, AVAC has evolved and been focused looking at HIV prevention, research and development more broadly, including PrEP, and over the last decade, looking at the delivery of new prevention, because as you know better than anybody, R&D by itself doesn't end epidemics. It's when you deliver the fruits of science. And so we work really at that nexus of science, policy, activism, communication, trying to pull all those pieces together to hopefully get impact.
What I've loved about the work that you've done, Mitch, is that you have not thought about innovation on its own, but innovation leading to transformation, actually getting results. And you're a close friend of the family because you've nurtured both the leadership and the organizational skills of one of our hosts, Yvette Raphael, who, of course, is now a fierce leader herself in the global AIDS response, particularly as it relates to HIV prevention. But taking a sort of a bigger view of where we are in the world, this current moment must be really frustrating and concerning for you.
It is. And, you know, watching now, I think we're on day 102 or so of this new administration, not that I'm counting. I can't believe we got this far and to have seen the amount of destruction in its wake. And that in and of itself would be such a travesty. When I look at the dismantling and destruction of programs, of relationships across the board. But what makes it particularly heinous in the HIV world is that we stand now 58 days away from perhaps the most important advance in HIV prevention in 44 years of this epidemic. And when I think back to just 6 or 8 months ago, we were celebrating the advance of science, the injectable Lenacapavir clinical trial results that we only dreamed of decades ago, that you would have no infections in an HIV prevention trial. And then the second trial showing almost as good an effect. And this excitement to actually do the right thing, because as you know, we have squandered pretty much every prevention moment in the history of the epidemic. And the science of last year really was a catalyst for different approaches, different thinking, different ambition. And so we are, and I want to say we are. I don't want to say we were yet, because I am not ready to move this into the past tense. I believe we still are poised to act on science and innovation to deliver something that frankly was unimaginable a few years back. I'm not willing to give up and say the 102 days that have passed have destroyed our ability to do it. They have certainly increased the degree of difficulty. And HIV prevention didn't need more difficulty. And yet that's where we sit today.
So you say HIV prevention was always difficult, and it's really hard to measure something that hasn't happened as opposed to something that you've been able actually to achieve to do. So HIV treatment, for example, you can measure how many HIV positive people you've put on treatment. But we've had a range of interventions for HIV prevention, from condoms, obviously, to abstinence and behavior change that then led to the ABC, the condoms. We've had the dapivirine ring, the microbicide. We've had male circumcision, something that a ignorant Elon Musk joked about and was enthused that he was able to terminate funding in Mozambique for. And we are now adding this long-acting injectable to the armamentarium, as it were. It truly does become the choice agenda. But what is so special about the long-acting?
So, you did a beautiful job of describing that history. I will just add that when I remember first meeting you, you were working in the office of one Peter Piot, and it was at a moment in time when I was involved in the female condom. So we've been down this path of new products and innovation. And with each one, when I think about from the female condom through to voluntary medical male circumcision, to early days of oral PrEP, to the dapivirine vaginal ring, there was always hesitation. You'd see the data and then there'd be but. So the female condom is safe and effective. Oh, but would women use it? Oh, circumcision, unbelievably safe and effective. But would men actually get circumcised? And we spend a lot of time in this community of ours re-adjudicating reasons to do things and why reasons perhaps that some don't want to do things. And every one of those innovations had a policymaker or a funder or a community raise all the legitimate questions about why something might not work. And frankly, we've never been able to overcome that. I think back to oral PrEP, when the results came out 15 years ago. I remember a leading organization, the AIDS Healthcare Foundation, that's tried to single-handedly prevent PrEP from even seeing the light of day. And what I remember saying at the FDA for that committee meeting about oral PrEP, that the concerns and the questions are real, but they're not a reason not to do something. So we've spent now 30 years with innovation since the female condom. Every time we get a question or a concern or an uncertainty, we use it as an excuse not to act. And we, along with many others, have helped to document that actually very, sad history of missed opportunity. And I think what makes Lenacapavir different is two-part. One, the data. The data from the Purpose 1 and Purpose 2 trials are remarkable. Now, I'll say that cabotegravir, which had results just a few years earlier, are not that different from lenacapavir. But this is an every 6-monthly injectable, so theoretically slightly easier to deliver, we think. You still see people say, well, what about this? What about the cost? What about the program delivery? Will people come every 6 months? They're questions we don't have answers for, but the only way to answer them is to go do it. And I think what we finally have been able to do is to get donors to think a little differently. And this is where we get into this really tricky moment. In December, after a lot of advocacy based on the data, PEPFAR, under its then ambassador John Nkengasong, and the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB, and Malaria under the leadership of Peter Sands, agreed to something that we were all fighting for, and that was an ambitious prevention agenda to offer Len at a speed and scale and equity that had never been seen before in prevention. And there's part of me as the historian that says, why weren't you all doing this 30 years ago with the female condom, or 15 years ago with VMMC, or 10 years ago with oral PrEP, or 4 years ago with cabotegravir and the dapivirine vaginal ring? I can spend a lot of my time about why we missed those opportunities and how sad it is, because we could have seen a bigger, faster decline of incidence. But especially after these last 102 days, I want to spend a lot less time looking back and a lot more time looking forward. And we had a commitment in December, and I want to make sure that we hold the stakeholders accountable to deliver on that. And I think we can, because if we don't, the risk of that rate of new infections, which has slowly declined over 20 years, the risk it will pop back up is very real right now after what's happened with PEPFAR. And Lenacapavir, I believe, is our best hope. It's not a perfect product, but it is our best hope to re-engage and reimagine prevention because, frankly, people do like innovation. This administration likes innovation. Communities in East and Southern Africa and Asia, Latin America, and the U.S., they like innovation. So we have some common ground there, and we have to make sure we lean into that.
Well, not wanting to piss on your parade, Mitch, and I'm actually really grateful to hear your enthusiasm, but I can't help feeling that the collapse in US funding, particularly for PEPFAR, is going to make it really difficult, if not nigh impossible, for countries, regardless of price of Lenacapavir. And I think we're all moving in the right direction on pricing and voluntary licensing arrangements and mass manufacturing regionally and in the global south. But budgets for HIV, period, treatment and prevention are going to be reduced significantly. And sitting in on some of these, and I know you were on these calls too, these multi-sector global AIDS strategy 2026 to 2031 consultations, we're already hearing that rates of HIV infection are going up and going up very significantly. So how do we persuade African national AIDS policymakers not to dismiss Lenacapavir and indeed cabotegravir long-acting to be part of their AIDS strategies, their prevention strategies? And how do we get funding from a much reduced pie to cover that when they have so many other priorities?
It's the perfect question. And I will tell you, for all of my optimism, I piss on my own parade. I feel somewhat schizophrenic in both being optimistic because we have to seize this opportunity, but also realistic and even pessimistic that the stars are aligning to repeat the history of squandered opportunity. So how do I navigate that? So there are a few things. One, it is going to be a radically different experience. We thought in December that PEPFAR and Global Fund were going to collaborate the two agencies together with support from some philanthropies to get Lenacapavir to at least 2 million people at launch or in the first couple of years post-launch. Global Fund is committed that they are still there, but they're in the middle of a replenishment. And who knows how that's going to go in the current economic environment, as you said at the top of the pod. There's some dark clouds there. I do think that part of this is making sure that we have very clear evidence. And it gets actually to something you said about the choice agenda. I think we have to remember that choice is something that stakeholders across the entire value chain make. We ultimately want individuals to have choices of options that work for them. That's what the Choice Manifesto, that's what Yvette and colleagues of the African Women's Prevention Community Accountability Board said. But those choices only become possible if donors and ministries of health and product developers make their choices. So I think we have to have a much more nuanced, much more strategic conversation about those choices. And I think this is less about choice between Len and Cab and DVR and condoms and circumcision. This is a choice. Do we want to reduce the number of new infections? Yes or no? That's a real question. And I think we need to challenge everybody to that. Because if we plateaued at about 1.3 million new infections, and you're right, I think it's going to start going back up as we look at data at the end of this year, given what's happened. If we believe that that is wrong, if we believe that is preventable, then we have to decide how we're going to deal with it. And it's probably not saying that everybody gets access to everything. I think we need to show that we as a global community and at the national level and number of countries with high incidence, that we know how to drive down new infections. I don't know, but I believe rolling out injectable PrEP can be our fastest accelerator of that. So one of the things we need to do with donors is, this is not to give Len everywhere at launch later this year. This is to pick a handful of countries and do this with a speed and a scale and an equity in at least 5 or 6 or 8 countries. I'm making up the number, but probably a single digit. And over the next 2 years, be able to show people, look, that's how you drive down incidence. We've not been able to do that with these other technologies. And it's not because those technologies don't work. It's because the system hasn't worked for those products. And so we have to seize this opportunity. And again, it doesn't mean Len is better than the rest, but it means that we have this window right now. I believe it was open a lot in December. It's steadily closing. It's about to crash down. We have 58 days. June 19th is the date for the FDA to make a decision. A month later, we believe WHO will issue guidelines for Lenacapavir. So we have to ask ourselves as a community, are we willing to let the window shut and we just say, whoops, sorry? Or do we say, you know what? We can't do everything to overcome all of the obstacles that you rightly named. And I'm not saying we can wish those obstacles away. I wish we could, but we can't. But can we take this little piece and do something of meaning and of impact? And then I think we'll be able to go to countries in 2 or 3 years to say, if you realign the resources you're now spending locally, and if you do this much on land or other prep options, you can see incidence decline. We need to get the evidence of that.
So you mentioned, and I think it's important that listeners and viewers understand this, that Lenacapavir for prevention is not yet approved anywhere in the world. And you mentioned the FDA reviewing and hopefully coming to a decision to approve it in the middle of June. A number of pharmaceutical companies are getting quite anxious that the devastation in the number of staff in the FDA are making approvals much more, or consideration, I should say, of product approvals much more difficult, and that there is a backlog being developed. In prepping for this, excuse the pun, but in prepping for this episode, I said I wanted to ask you whether you felt that the job cuts in the FDA might affect the timeline for the review of Lenacapavir PrEP approval. What's your current thinking on that?
Well, I'll tell you, Ben, to be perfectly honest, everything every day makes me more and more anxious. So and anyone who's not anxious in the world right now probably isn't paying attention. I don't want to raise your or anyone else's anxiety, but so I'm anxious. That said, the FDA did grant Gilead Sciences an accelerated review because it was seen as a priority for review. So they said earlier this year that instead of a 10-month review, they would do it in 6. And they set what the FDA calls a PDUFA date, which is a user fee the company has to pay. I think because of the system and the fact that it was far enough along in the system, to dismantle that now would be remarkably disruptive. So I believe that June 19th, which is a public holiday in the United States, although it's a holiday that I suspect this administration may try to wind back, but whether it's a public holiday in the next 2 months or not, June 19th or 18th or 20th, if I were a betting person, and I'm not, but if I were, I would bet that it will still get an FDA determination by that date. That may be more hope than reality, but I think we have to plan for that. I hope the FDA and its staff still exist in the next 2 months. Everything is up for question marks right now, but I think we have to mitigate disaster as best we can, and we have to plan for things to move forward on schedule. Because if we started spending all this time thinking it may not get approved, I think it gives people license to say, well, it's not such an urgent matter after all, because maybe it won't even get approved. Let's assume it's going to get approved on June 19th. And if Mitchell's wrong, what's the worst thing? You're going to call me on June 20th and say, hey, Mitchell, you were wrong on April 30th. I'm willing to take that risk. I think we need to plan as if it's happening and deal with it. And then remember, too, even if, God forbid, something happened on the FDA side, WHO is still on track to issue guidelines, and the European Medicines Agency, both for Europe as well as through their Medicines for All program, are sitting on an application. They're reviewing it now. It is not beholden to American politics, thank God, and they're on track to give an opinion by September. So even if something were to happen, and I don't think it will, but even if it did, we should assume we're going to see WHO guidelines and then EMA a couple months later. We should do this. By World AIDS Day 2025, we should know that some significant numbers of doses of Lenacapavir are making their way to a handful of countries to programmatically deliver impact. And that's my metric, because if we don't do that, then there's a failure of the donors, there's a failure of governments, there's a failure of civil society, and there's a failure of Gilead. So that's my metric of success. I'm making World AIDS Day just because we all talk about World AIDS Day. But if we are not poised to get Len in people by December 1st in low and middle income countries, we have failed. We have failed people. And most of all, we have failed the participants in the Purpose 1 and Purpose 2 trials, who, like every other trial participant, has given of their bodies and their time and their commitment. But they did something that's rarely seen. They delivered us a near perfect prevention option. Let's not let them down.
And we are failing ourselves if we don't plan for implementation. And it goes back to that criticism of all of us, I think, that happened in the first few weeks of the administration, that we obey in advance, in anticipation. And I think we've got to be really aware that we don't do that. It's something that Eric Gooseby and I have been thinking about as we look at the future of the global AIDS response, not to bemoan what is happening around us, but to start planning about what we do next, where we go from here.
100%.
And so I think what you're saying is just a really strong reminder to us all, a call to action in a sense, of let us plan for what we need to do regardless of what is thrown at us.
Absolutely. I spent my whole career working around, adjacent to, and in some years funded by USAID. The idea that it is not going to be part of our ecosystem from September, which is when the State Department has said they're folding USAID in, is devastating on a personal level. I think it's going to have huge disruption. It already is having huge disruption in the world. And we need to make sure that, but I remember too, in the UK, not long ago, DFID was folded into the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and we have FCDO. This is not, in and of itself, that transition is not unique. Even democratic administrations in this country have tried to do that. I think we need to remember what we're fighting for. And I think we talked about this, I think, last year. There's been a lot of talk about the sustainability agenda of PEPFAR. And, what are we sustaining? I'm not here to sustain acronyms, PEPFAR or AVAC or anybody else's. And a shot in the arm doesn't really have an acronym, but I'm not here to sustain acronyms or names of projects or organizations. I'm not here to sustain the funding, because sustainability in the last couple of years has often been about who's going to pay for something. And that we're just really moving the money from U.S. government funding to other countries' funding. That's now happening in a matter of weeks and months as opposed to 5 years in a thoughtful, strategic way. That's a problem. But what's fundamentally important is that the sustainability agenda should have always been about how do we sustain the impact? And I think if we do that, we're remembering what we're trying to build is not agencies, or it's the classic form follows function. The function is to sustain the impact. What's going to get us there? It's probably not what we had on January 19th. We're never going back to January 19th. We have to go forward to something very different.
Yeah, I completely agree. There is a report coming from the HIV Leadership Forum, this group of directors general of national AIDS commissions around the world. It was produced in October. It's just coming up for launch, but it anticipated where we are and calling for a much more rapid transition from donor-led priorities to country-owned priorities. We've all been calling for it, but it's more about, I think, how we in the North manage country priorities rather than countries themselves setting priorities and then telling us how we can help or not. And perhaps this moment has really pressed that agenda much more rapidly. It's something AVAC has been working towards. It's something certainly I've personally embraced when we closed down the Pangea Global AIDS Foundation back in, 2017, something we were very committed to doing. But can I take a slightly different track? Because there's something else that you and I are doing that is very similar and we're both involved in. Me on a domestic front, you very much on the international front. And it is being part of legal action to challenge some of the president's executive orders. I'm the chair of the San Francisco Community Health Center, and we are challenging, as part of a case being brought by Lambda Legal, on some of the executive orders relating to DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, as it relates to services for the trans community. You're focused and are part of action, I guess, related to some of the collapse and termination of funding that the federal government had already committed to international funding. Could you talk a little bit, as far as you can, about what you're doing there?
So it is remarkable. You mentioned the executive orders. Every president has the right and ability to issue executive orders. The executive orders were never intended to be the way in which governments were run. Most presidents issued a handful of them on very particular issues. But the executive orders were intended to be the way in which governments were run. Most presidents issued a handful of them on very particular issues. Most presidents issued a handful of them on very particular issues. But the executive orders were never intended to be the way in which governments were run. Most presidents issued a handful of them on very particular issues. this president, because he knows that Congress won't actually vote for some of the things he's saying, is basically managing by executive order. And he also knows Congress isn't going to tell him no. And that's one of the biggest problems. Crazily enough, in the very first day of his administration, on Inauguration Day, one of the first executive orders was the so-called reevaluation and realignment of foreign assistance. And I say all that in inverted commas because we know they're not evaluating anything. They are destroying foreign assistance. And within 4 days, they issued a number of stop work orders on projects funded by USAID and the State Department. We had a project, actually one of our partners on a wonderful project called the Coalition to Accelerate and Support Prevention Research, CASPR, funded by USAID under PEPFAR. One of the lead partners in that project with us is Pangaea Zimbabwe, the legacy of Pangaea Global, and many other African civil society partners. And that coalition is a tiny project relative to all of the USAID architecture of thousands of grants and billions of dollars. But we received a stop work order. And again, if the government had said, we're going to do a 90-day pause on foreign assistance to review, don't start new work, but keep doing what you're doing, and in 90 days, we're going to decide who shall stay and who shall go, we would have been concerned and frustrated, but it would have been relatively legitimate and legal. Instead, they issued a blanket stop work orders across the board. And we began to talk with Public Citizen, a U.S.-based public litigation organization, about a lawsuit because we believe that's illegal. And it's not illegal because AVAC is owed a grant. It's illegal because Congress has appropriated funding for foreign assistance. We are just one piece of that puzzle, and the president can't stop it. And that's what we said. That's what you do in a lawsuit. You say what you believe. And it was finally filed on February 10th. A parallel suit was filed the day after by the Global Health Council and a few other large USAID recipients. The cases continue being reviewed together. And 3 days later, on February 13th, we received a temporary restraining order, which told the government, you're not allowed to do that. And in a temporary restraining order, they don't say that the government's wrong. They say the plaintiffs, AVAC in this case, have the likelihood of success. You should stop until we have a full court hearing. Of course, the government dragged their feet, delayed, and went back and forth. There have been a number of legal documents. And finally, in March, after a month, a hearing was held, and the judge in our case required the State Department and USAID to begin a basic principle: pay your bills. And they were required to pay the bill for anyone in January through February 13th when the temporary restraining order was offered. And happily, that's a win, and the government very slowly has begun to pay. And since March 10th or 12th, they've begun to drip out money to cover past bills, although they're taking what used to be done in a day or a week has taken many months. And this was meant to be for plaintiffs, those of us that led the suits, as well as non-plaintiffs. The government, though, just a couple of weeks ago appealed to the higher court, the circuit court, and we're all waiting for the circuit court to give guidance, whether they review it, maybe it goes to the Supreme Court. But in the midst of all of that, they terminated projects, and then, of course, they said they're going to fold USAID in. So people say, well, why'd you do that lawsuit, Mitchell? Even if you win in court, the agency's gone, the projects are going to be gone. We did it for two reasons. One, because someone has to stand up to a regime that does things that are illegal or perceived to be illegal. And it's someone's, and AVAC is one of many, and including in other cases, thanks to your leadership in the domestic case. So you have to say that's what's wrong. The other thing is to create a public record. One of the most remarkable things of our case is the exhibits that have been entered into the court, including from 9 different USAID whistleblowers under anonymous names who've described how the Secretary of State and the people from the Department of Government Efficiency, DOJ, and others were actually doing one thing but telling the president and the press something else. They were lying, and they were lying in court. We now have solid evidence of that, and that won't turn USAID back on. It's not going to refund CASPR and help Pangaea, but it is going to prove the point that you can't act just because you got elected to be the president of the United States, because this was once, and I'd like to think still is, a democracy. And I hope that, and the third piece to this is Congress has either had its authority usurped by the president or is abdicating, or a combination of the two. Now, obviously, there are members of Congress who've been very strong, but the fact that 2 months after the court case, 3 months after inauguration, Congress, including a former senator, Marco Rubio, now our Secretary of State, hasn't said, hey, wait, PEPFAR is what I supported. I was a co-sponsor of PEPFAR back in the day. This is a reminder that Congress has a job to do. They've appropriated these funds, and I hope that that's going to stand the test of time and make sure that people know when the history books are written that there were illegalities, there was impoundment of federal money that Congress appropriated, and I hope it doesn't take history books to do it. I hope we can do it in real time over the next many months. But it's one of many advocacy vehicles we need to pursue.
Well, of course, history books are written by the victors, so we need to be the victors for all sorts of reasons. But I think that's incredibly important what you're doing. And I have said to folks in the domestic AIDS response and the domestic civil society response, the international side is maybe 3-4 weeks ahead of what's happening domestically. It's almost as if the international side is sort of testing the waters to see how things can follow on the domestic front. I've never been more aware of global being local and local being global, and not in a good way.
No.
But can I ask you another, perhaps broader question around what this means about American influence and American power? You and I are both, I think, of the opinion that there is rightly a move to the role of northern practitioners of global health, not as decision makers and not as overseers of implementers, but rather as supporters and as resources for leaders in the global south, for want of a better phrase, to call on and to utilize as they see fit. I wonder, though, how you see the way in which these decisions over the last 100 days have played out. And if you look at it from the sense of global health security, both in terms of enabling and supporting countries to manage their own responses to something as profoundly dangerous as the HIV epidemic, and as a way of building partnerships and trusted relationships for the United States, and indeed for Western liberal democracies, if indeed the United States can be called a member of that club anymore, that this has been a really difficult and indeed dangerous way of imploding both those kinds of influential, mutually beneficial relationships.
Absolutely. Some of this is an English language lesson, not for you because you have a wonderful English accent. Assistance is not charity. It's never been charity. And when you look back at the earliest days of the founding of USAID, thanks to President Kennedy, something I wish his nephew, now Secretary of Health and Human Services, would understand, that it was never charity. It was about partnership. Now, it has emerged and evolved, and obviously all the conversations about localization and decolonization and recentering global health. We've learned a hell of a lot more, and we need to do a hell of a lot better than we did in the last 60, 70, 80 years. But this is not charity, and I think it's some of the greatest acts of foreign diplomacy. PEPFAR is the best example, not the only, but the best example, I think. And when you think about who's led PEPFAR, you can pick out names. One of them, your co-host, Eric Gooseby, Debbie Birx, Mark Dybel, John Nkengasong. They had one thing in common. Their title was ambassador. Their position sat in the U.S. State Department. Why? Because there was a recognition by a Republican President George Bush and by bipartisan members of Congress, including Senator Rubio at the time, that this was not only about an HIV epidemic. This was about global health and global security, and most of all, about diplomacy. And we lose sight of that. And just under Ambassador Nkengasong's tenure, PEPFAR was put in a new Bureau of Global Health Security and Diplomacy. Diplomacy's been a part of this program from its beginning 20 years ago. I would argue it's been a part of USAID for its entire history. And we should never forget that. And I think that's where the current administration clearly doesn't understand what it's doing, because they talk rightly about wanting to make America very rightly and fairly safer, stronger, and more prosperous. That's a diplomatic agenda, and that's a PEPFAR agenda. I would argue that PEPFAR and USAID have made America safer, stronger, and more prosperous, and at the same time made hundreds of partner countries and communities safer, stronger, and more prosperous. That's the whole nature of this work. And I think if this weren't such a tragic moment, you would look back and say, wow, you guys just don't understand. You can realign to your policy perspective, but you're not only destroying health programs, you're not taking treatment out of people's mouths and hands and bodies, you're destroying American reputation, American relationships that are at the heart of diplomatic activity. And I think you would find if you talk to career diplomats, particularly career ambassadors, not political appointees, but career diplomats who've served all over the world, every one of them, irrespective of who appointed them to be an ambassador, would tell you that foreign assistance has been the most powerful tool in building those partnerships and relationships. And there's a lot of conversation now when we step back as a country. Who steps in? Well, we want countries to step in and cover their own costs and do more. And that was the road to sustainability in PEPFAR that Ambassador Nkengasong began. Even Ambassador Gooseby talked about this. Ambassador Birx talked about this. I worry that as we withdraw, the center is not filled only by those African countries leading themselves, but it's going to be filled by countries that we see as our rivals, most uniquely China, which anyone who travels in Africa knows that most roads, most airports, most trains between Nairobi and Mombasa have been built with Chinese support. Now, their foreign assistance has not looked like PEPFAR. It's looked like roads and infrastructure and airports and trains, etc. But do we think that we're just failing on the AIDS response now? No, we're failing on the AIDS response, and we are taking ourselves out of diplomatic relationships, even if we still have an ambassador in the country. This is what is just...
Even that is questionable. The proposed revisions to the State Department see us cutting significant numbers of embassies across Africa.
Absolutely.
Which plays into this simplistic view of the presidents that Africa is, I won't use the term that he's used, but it's just not worth investing in.
And it is, I think every continent, every country is going to have an important role to play in the future geopolitically. But when you think just simply because of the success of HIV response from PEPFAR and the Global Fund and national governments, we are seeing more young people born in Africa than anywhere else. This is the future. And we had an opportunity to help be part of a future. We needed to step back and step aside and be partners, but we needed to do it in a strategic way, not in a unilateral, dysfunctional, destructive, chaotic way. That's what it's done. And then even on the micro issue, when clinics restart, are people going to feel comfortable going back? Are they going to trust that clinic? Are they going to trust the provider? We have undermined what has taken decades to build up. And it reminds me a lot of little kids spending hours with their Lego or their building blocks, building a beautiful tower that's often taller than they are. They get the little chair to go even taller. It takes hours to build, and it takes just 1 second to pull one brick out and the whole thing comes crumbling down. That's what we have done. We have had, again, it hasn't been easy. The buildings may not look beautiful always, but the architecture of global health has been built over many decades, and it has been destroyed in 100 days by the stroke of a pen on an executive order. And we now have to rebuild something completely different.
You know what it reminds me of? It's like the withdrawal from Afghanistan on acid, and there's no coming back from this. Whatever we see will be completely different, and our roles in it will be completely different if we have any at all.
Absolutely. We spent a lot of the first couple months, all of us as a community, there was paralysis, there was kind of being shell-shocked, despair. There's still now, I think it's like the stages of grief. We've gone from head in sand and paralysis to now self-preservation. How do I make sure my fill in the blank continues? We need to move faster. And a lot of that has been because we keep trying to fill all the holes in the dike, but the holes are coming fast and furiously. I think we need to declare that dike irreparable. And I think we need to go upstream and build an entirely new dike. And that means different owners, different operators, different architects, different everything. And that's the view that we need to bring into the field right now. And I hope that people will allow American and American organizations to be partners with it, because I think this is what the world needs, is a whole new way of thinking.
Now, it's a very interesting way that you've described it. I completely agree. Completely agree. And that actually is the exciting opportunity in front of us. But the lens that we in the United States and the global north have to approach this is we hope that we will be invited to be part of that conversation. We cannot assume that we have the leading seats at the table anymore.
That's right.
I want to ask you, I guess as we come to the top of the hour, we've both been really interested in the development of the 2026 to 2031 global AIDS strategy that UNAIDS, of course, that's its job, is convening and thinking about. And before January the 20th, we were all assuming that this was going to be really focused on the goal of ending the AIDS epidemic as a public health crisis by 2031. Who knows if that is a realistic, achievable target anymore? But I just wondered, from your perspective, what you see as a realistic but ambitious strategy for the world to embrace between now and 2031.
The starting point needs to be a reimagination of the targets and a rearticulation. I'm struck, in 2014, when the targets for 2020 were being developed, just on the prevention side, the idea by 2020 by UNAIDS, endorsed by the UN member states, was to get the number of new infections from 1.7 million down to 500,000 in no more than 500,000 by 2020. Of course, we missed that target by a mile. The infection rates were still at 1.5 million. So what did we do? We created a 2025 target that was even more ambitious. We said we're going to get it down to lower than 370,000. It's like, wait a minute, folks, we didn't do this. The gap got bigger, and now you're going to make an even more ambitious target. It can be a numbers game, and I think we need to be really cautious that the strategy can't be a numbers game. It can't say, well, our 2031 target is to have fewer than 200,000 new infections. I'd love that. We are 6 years away, and we're still sitting at 1.3 million new infections, and we have good reason to fear that that number is actually going to go up. So I think we need to have whatever would have been the target setting in the strategy. It's almost like we need two versions of the strategy. What would have been had we not seen 100 days of terror? And how would you have continued and hopefully gotten a little closer to this year's target? And then you need to say, and here's the strategy for what happens after 100 days of terror. And we need to say, okay, folks, it's different, radically different. And I think the whole methodology of developing that strategy needs to be different. I worry that sometimes we iterate on past documents. We all do that in our organizations. So let's take up last year's report. Let's take up last year's proposal and dust it off. This is a massive rewrite. And I'll just say that the really negative piece of that number of infections going up, that's what I think is kind of in the draft of the history book. Wow, 2025 saw horror and infections went up. I don't believe that draft is complete. I don't believe it's been penned into ink or carved into stone. We have a chance to rewrite that even today. And I worry about making it, well, what are we going to do by 2031? And maybe, well, we'll catch up in 2028 because there'll be a U.S. presidential election. I don't think anyone's saying that explicitly, but I would not want that to be the implicit message. We need actions today that recapture the narrative. And it can't be, we cannot allow what's being written currently by the U.S. regime to be the first chapter of the strategy. We need to take ownership of this. And when I say we, I mean partners, civil society, activists, policymakers, and funders, particularly in the Global South, to drive a vision that works, not a vision that is going to sit in the halls of a UN General Assembly and people are going to say, oh, great, we all agreed, but we didn't do anything about it.
Yeah. And we can't let that strategy be driven by predictions about what happens in the political discourse in the United States. That just is not realistic or feasible. Hey, Mitch, what have we missed? Is there anything that we haven't covered that you think we should?
Well, it's just, this is a moment like a real pivot, a real, you hear it all the time. And it's easy to get into the despair mode and of the paralysis mode. And I think fundamentally, we've talked about it, I think this is a time to seize innovation. It's a time to center leadership where we need it, which is not in Washington or in Geneva. It's in every other capital. It's about making sure that we prioritize. I think we all need to think about the things we've done in our careers, in our organizations, in our fields, and recognize that this is going to take a new level of prioritization. There are things that we might think are really important that we've just got to let go of. And that's going to be hard. I don't know what those are, but each of us probably has a handful of things that we love doing that may not be the right things to do anymore. And I hope that we have the clarity of mind, because if we don't decide the things that we're not going to do, it's going to be decided by Elon Musk. It's going to be decided by Marco Rubio. It's going to be decided by the 28-year-old who's sitting in the State Department overseeing the future of foreign assistance. I don't want them making those decisions. Now, the fact that we give you the world, here are the priorities, fund more of this, don't fund that, doesn't mean it's going to happen that way, but we need to provide a counter narrative. Just as the Heritage Foundation provided Project 2025, we need to write our own project that says this is the narrative we can imagine. Doesn't mean we're going to get it to be done that way, but if we don't, it's going to be written by a bunch of people who not only don't understand science or research or global health, but they don't care.
I think that's very, very sound advice. We have to produce the counter-narrative, and it has to be a victorious one. Yep. Hey, a complete change of subject here. I realize over the hundreds and hundreds of decades that you and I have known each other, we've never spoken about music. And not to put you on the spot, but I have a feeling that you're a bit of a soft rock person. Well, am I right?
It's funny. And I thought about this because it's happened 8 years ago. Now, a little known history factoid. A couple of days after the current president, whose name I don't like to use, was elected, a very dark day happened. And Leonard Cohen, I think the greatest poet of our time, passed away. And Leonard Cohen, and so it's not really soft rock as much as, and some people even said he wasn't really a singer because he had that beautiful scratchy voice. There was a song that came out and it's a really important album. It's called The Future. Came out in 1992. And there are two songs, it's a great album, but there are two songs in particular that I would direct people's attention to. One is actually called Democracy. And it says, democracy is coming to the USA. Leonard Cohen, sitting in Canada, proud Canadian, wrote this in 1991, I guess, or 92, came out in 92. Democracy's coming to the USA. And I kind of always heard that and thought, kind of silly, we've had it since 1776, but oh my God, he was a visionary, and from the grave, now 8 years later, I'm reminded of him because of that. And the second song on that album is my absolute favorite. It's called Anthem, because it has the most beautiful line I think I can imagine. And I know a lot of us talked about this 8 years ago, but it's even truer today. Ring the bells that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. And 8 years ago, I remember saying that, and I was like, oh, the cracks are like intense, and I don't see the light. But we saw the light, and we got there. And I don't want to sugarcoat this. Yeah. I don't have rose-colored glasses. I don't know that these cracks can be filled. But my God, the cracks are huge right now. Lenacapavir is a little bit of light. Civil society leadership, Pangea, APA in South Africa led by VET, those are the lights. And if we let them in, maybe, just maybe, we can get back to democracy in the USA and democracy in the world, because that's what Leonard Cohen told us to do in 1992. The future. Everyone should listen to the album.
Leonard Cohen, singer-songwriter, as a prophet for the future. Absolutely. Well, Mitch, thank you so much for being with us today and sharing your views. Really upbeat and really, really needed. We'll keep in touch, and I have all fingers crossed, everything crossed indeed, for some positive outcomes, both in terms of the court action with Public Citizen and, of course, some really good news mid-June on the approval of Lenacapavir. And keep fighting the good fight.
Thanks so much, Ben. Great to see you, and I look forward to keeping in touch.
Well, that's it for this episode. Thanks so much to Mitchell Warren. Thanks also to our director and producer, Erica Spera of News.media. And finally, a big thanks to you. Don't forget, you can find us wherever you download your podcasts. And don't forget to check us out on our YouTube channel. Review us, give us 5 stars, and have a great week and a safe week, everyone.